Earlier this month, there was a media buzz when Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett joined 5 other justices in rejecting a Republican challenge to Obamacare. It came on the heels of several other rulings in which Kavanaugh and Chief Justice John Roberts surprised observers by siding with the court's liberal justices. Perhaps, some thought, this court would not be as right-wing as we all thought. Not quite. Because when it comes to the biggest issue of all, preserving our democracy, our voting rights, the 6 conservative justices always fall into line. Exhibit A is today's Supreme Court ruling, a monumental defeat for democracy. By a partisan, yes, 6-3 vote, the highest court in the land today upheld 2 restrictive voting measures used by Arizona in the last election. One requires election supervisors to literally throw out votes that were cast at the wrong precinct. Another makes it illegal for someone to turn in another voter's early ballot at a polling place. The stated rationale for the 2 restrictions was the danger of voter fraud. But when lawmakers gathered to draft the ballot harvesting law, as it's known, in 2016, they couldn't find any evidence of voter fraud. Even the state's elections director, a Republican, could point to no specific instances where someone tossed away someone else's early ballot, something that was already a crime. GOP lawmakers pressed on anyway back in 2016. One even argued that perception, not reality, was the important thing. Quote, "What is indisputable is that many people believe it's happening. You can't really argue with that. And I think that matters." Of course, the fraud didn't happen, but something interesting did happen. Both the Arizona restrictions, both of them, did impact minorities disproportionately. Surprise! Last year, a federal appeals court struck down the laws after finding that twice as many Black, Latino, and Native American voters cast their ballots in the wrong precinct when compared with white voters. That was a violation of Section 2 of the landmark 1965 Voting Rights Act. The panel ruled. But the Supreme Court's conservative wing, its conservative majority, reversed that decision today. In an opinion written by Samuel Alito, 6 justices said, "It's totally fine to regulate fraud that doesn't exist." Quote, "Election fraud has had serious consequences in other states. The Arizona legislature was not obligated to wait for something similar to happen closer to home." As for the discriminatory effects of the laws, the majority did find ample evidence that Arizona Republicans wanted to make it harder for Democrats to vote, but it added, quote, "Partisan motives are not the same as racial motives." Hey, that's all right then. In a 41-page dissenting opinion, Justice Elena Kagan blasted the court's conservatives for further eroding the Voting Rights Act. Quote, "I could say that this is not how the court is supposed to interpret and apply statutes, but that ordinary critique woefully undersells the problem." Oh, yes, it does. This ruling will make it harder to challenge the hundreds of proposed voting restrictions being pushed by Republicans across the country. And it came on the same day that Georgia's notorious new GOP voting law goes into effect. The same day that the Kansas League of Women Voters and other non-partisan groups suspended their voter registration drives out of fear that they could be arrested under that state's new voting restrictions. Democrats have had little success blocking these laws at the state level. At the federal level, they have S1, the For the People Act, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, both of which would strengthen federal oversight of elections and make new restrictions harder to pass. In fact, in a statement today, Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema, one of the 2 Senate Democrats who have refused to eliminate the Republican filibuster, said today's ruling will hurt Arizonans' ability to make their voices heard at the ballot box, adding that Congress should come together to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which I am proud to co-sponsor. What unmitigated chutzpah to be one of 2 Democrats standing in the way of progress and then bemoaning the lack of progress. But look, even if Democrats convince Sinema and fellow holdout Joe Manchin to end the filibuster, to move one of these bills, to get Joe Biden to sign it into law fast, it could just be gutted straight away by this partisan Supreme Court, packed as it is by Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell. This court, which Neil Gorsuch joined after the outright theft of Merrick Garland's seat. It was supposed to be Garland's. This court, which Amy Coney Barrett joined last year, after 40 million Americans had already voted in the election, early voted, in an election that her benefactor Donald Trump then lost. It increasingly feels as if the question, how do we save American democracy, depends on the answer to another question. How do we change, fix, rebalance this Supreme Court? Joining me now are Megan Hatcher-Mays, Director of Democracy Policy for the progressive nonprofit Indivisible, and Brian Fallon, co-founder and Executive Director of Demand Justice and former National Press Secretary to Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign. Thank you both for joining me, both of you coming back on the show. It's just sad it's under these circumstances. A horrible decision today. Megan, let me start with you. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, lawmakers, almost all Republican lawmakers, have introduced nearly 400 new voting restrictions in 48 states this year. 22 of them have already become law. How much does today's court ruling narrow the grounds or get rid of the grounds for challenging any of those laws?
Yeah, today's decision, I really can't overstate it. It was horrific. It's a very, very dark day for our democracy. What was left of the Voting Rights Act has now been significantly undermined. It has been gutted. The Supreme Court was not content to just gut sections 4 and 5 back in 2013. They decided to finish the job today, and they significantly undermined Section 2, which was like one of the remaining enforcement mechanisms in the Voting Rights Act. That means that future challenges under Section 2 will have to follow this new set of rules that Justice Alito just made up out of nowhere today. And it's going to be extremely hard for voters who have been targeted by these racist suppression laws to make their case in court as a direct result of today's decision. It's very, very bad.
Brian, there's that line the Washington Post uses, democracy dies in darkness. Actually, no, it dies in the plain sight of day in Samuel Alito verdicts, opinions. So my question to you is, where do you think the White House is in all of this, given the stakes are so high? Back in February, Joe Biden's DOJ wrote a letter to the Supreme Court that essentially said, sure, if you apply the Trump DOJ's interpretation of the Voting Rights Act, then these Arizona laws are fine, but the current DOJ, the new DOJ, disagrees with that interpretation. We're not backing this case anymore. But that's all they really did. I mean, couldn't the White House have done more? Shouldn't they be doing more to push back?
I think they should. And you saw the Biden White House react to the ruling today by pointing to the need to pass these bills in Congress, like the John Lewis Act, like the For the People Act. And while they're right that those bills are necessary, they're not sufficient. Because why are we needing to pass the John Lewis Act? It's because of a Supreme Court decision from 2013. We had a perfectly good law, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and it's because the conservatives on the Roberts Court are so hell-bent on uniting behind voter suppression efforts that are springing up from the states and red states that we have to do this Herculean task of trying to get Sinema and Manchin to get rid of the filibuster in order to pass a patchwork solution to solve the last bad Supreme Court ruling. It stands to reason that if we pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, we'll be right back here in front of the same Supreme Court playing whack-a-mole, trying to come up with a solution to another bad Supreme Court decision. As a matter of fact, in 2013, when John Roberts wrote the opinion that gutted Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, he specifically pointed to the continued, the perseverance of Section 2 and said that, well, Section 2 still exists, so people can still challenge discriminatory laws based on Section 2. And now here we are 8 years later, and now they've gone after Section 2. So they will not stop until they eradicate any voting protections that Congress may wish to pass. And that's why it's insufficient for the Biden White House to be pointing to the For the People Act. They also need to be getting behind Supreme Court reform, adding seats to the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, the Biden Commission, which is exploring this issue, which we just heard from yesterday, is for the most part twiddling its thumbs. We have a panel of academics that are still largely clinging to the idea that the court is an apolitical institution and that ideas like adding seats would make it unduly political. And that view has just been belied by rulings like today's.
Well said, twiddling their thumbs as democracy burns. I want to come back to Supreme Court reform in a moment. But Megan, let me just ask you about this line that jumped out today, because, the court says it takes the specter of voter fraud very seriously. But they also seem to say that basically racial disparities in legal outcomes aren't a problem. At one point in the majority opinion, Alito writes that because, quote, minority and non-minority groups differ with respect to employment, wealth, and education, even neutral regulations, even with neutral regulations, there will inevitably be some predictable disparities in rates of voting and non-compliance with voting rules. It seems as if this court is saying, well, the outcome's not the issue is intent. And, unless a sponsor of a law comes out and says, I'm doing this because I'm a racist, the court will never take racism seriously.
Right. Actually, it's very interesting that that line was very interesting because it was like Alito got this close to almost understanding that systemic racism exists, but then he took a hard right away from coming to that conclusion. But yeah, that's exactly right. That the idea now that under Section 2, based on these new rules that Justice Alito has written, and by the way, if Justice Alito wants to write legislation, I highly recommend he run for Congress. I would welcome his resignation from the Supreme Court. But that's what he did today. He rewrote this law because he felt like it. He has the power to do it. And he got 5 of his colleagues to go along with him. Yeah. But what he's done is basically said, he even acknowledged that these laws, there are disparities in how these laws affect different types of voters. But he just said, you know what, that's fine. That's actually fine because it's not that big of a deal. There's evidence in front of me that says there are disparities in how people are treated under these voting laws. But I'm throwing that out because there is this other thing that's bothering me, and it's the specter of voter fraud, which there is no evidence, not only no evidence in front of the Supreme Court, widespread or any other type of fraud. There's no evidence at all anywhere of widespread or any other type of voter fraud, but that bothered him more than actual evidence of Black people, indigenous people, and people of color being denied the right to vote. It is really, really gross to see kind of the big lie make its way all the way up to the Supreme Court today.
We've been saying on the show for a while, in terms of the hysteria over critical race theory, that why are Republicans obsessed with this stuff? It's not taught in elementary school, it's taught in law school. Apparently Sam Alito at law school didn't choose the critical race theory. As you mentioned, he came so close to understanding, but doesn't. Brian, let's get back to the main issue before we run out of time. The main issue, Supreme Court reform, fixing the Supreme Court. I have to ask you, nothing personal, but you worked for Hillary Clinton. I think it's fair to describe Hillary Clinton, not a pejorative, as an establishment Democrat. Joe Biden is an establishment Democrat. Why is it that establishment centrist Democrats do not get the need for urgent, radical reform, Supreme Court expansion, make D.C. a state, get rid of the filibuster? They want the ends, save democracy, but they won't will the means. Why, Brian? Why?
Well, I think there's still a lot of people that are hoping for the best and bought into the idea that John Roberts is an institutionalist. And I think two groups of people were exposed by today's ruling. The first, you referred to it in the open. The first was journalists who embarrassed themselves the last several weeks, creating this false narrative of a 3-3-3 court, trying to suggest that based on rulings in niche cases like this Goldman Sachs class action case, that, there's a moderate faction that's emerged on the court, and Roberts and Kavanaugh and Barrett are not going to be as bad as liberals thought they were, and they didn't even wait till the end of the term, and these two big democracy-related cases today belied that whole narrative. The second grouping is a broader establishment view that exists among a lot of legal elites and a lot of establishment figures, many of them progressives. A lot of them had a speaking role at yesterday's commission hearing. These are professors like Noah Feldman at Harvard. These are people like Stephen Breyer, who himself has suggested that he might not retire this year because he worries that retiring now would make the court look political. Well, of course, it's already political. And so I just recommend to all your viewers, people should go back and read Nicholas Bowie's testimony. He's a Harvard professor, testified and spoke truth to power yesterday at the commission, unpacked the history of how the court is an anti-democratic institution and will never fulfill our ambitions to become a true multiracial democracy unless we reform the court.
Hi, I'm Mehdi Hasan. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more of the Mehdi Hasan Show by clicking on any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thank you for watching.